Section 18 of Army Letters from an Officer's Wife, 1871-1888. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Sue Anderson. Army Letters from an Officer's Wife, 1871-1888, by Frances Roe. Section 18, Letters from 1884-1885. Fort Ellis, Montana Territory, November 1884. Only a few days more, and then we will be off for the East. It is over 7 years since we started from Corinne on that long march north, and I never dreamed at that time that I would remain right in this territory until a splendid railroad would be built to us from another direction to take us out of it. Nearly everything is packed. We expect to return here in the spring, but in the Army one never knows what destiny may have waiting for them at the War Department. Besides, I would not be satisfied to go so far away and leave things scattered about. The 2 horses, wagons, and everything of the kind have been disposed of, not because we wanted to sell them, but because Faye was unwilling to leave the horses with irresponsible persons during a long winter in this climate, when the most thoughtful care is absolutely necessary to keep animals from suffering. Lieutenant Gallagher of the cavalry bought them, and we are passing through our second experience of seeing others drive around horses we have petted and taught to know us apart from all others. George almost broke my heart the other day. He was standing in front of Lieutenant Gallagher's quarters that are near ours, when I happened to go out on the walk, not knowing the horses were there. He gave a loud, joyous whinny, and started to come to me, pulling Pete and the wagon with him. I ran back to the house, for I could not go to him. He had been my own horse, petted and fed lumps of sugar every day with my own hands, and I always drove him in single harness, because his speed was so much greater than Pete's. My almost gownless condition has been a cause of great worry to me, but Pogue has promised to fix up my wardrobe with a rush, and after the necessary time for that in Cincinnati, I will hurry on to Columbus Barracks for my promised visit to Dr. and Mrs. Gordon. Then on home. Faye will go to Cincinnati with me, and from there to the United States Naval Home, of which his father is governor at present. I will have to go there too before so very long. We attended a pretty cotillion in Bozeman last evening, and remained overnight at the hotel. Faye led, and was assisted by Mr. Ladd of Bozeman. It was quite a large and elaborate affair, and there were present the butcher, the baker, and the candlestick maker. Nevertheless, everything was conducted with the greatest propriety. There are 5 or 6 very fine families in the small place, people of culture and refinement from the East, and their influence in the building up of the town has been wonderful. The first year we were at Fort Ellis, one could see every now and then a number, usually 4 numerals, painted in bright red on the sidewalk. Everyone knew that to be the work of the vigilantes, and was a message to some gambler or horse thief to get himself out of town or stand the shotgun or rope jury. The first time I saw those red figures, I knew what they were for. It seemed as if they had been made in blood, and step over them I could not. I went out in the road around them. We have seen none of those things during the past 2 years, and for the sake of those who have worked so hard for law and order, we hope the desperado element has passed on. End of letter. Fort Shaw, Montana Territory, May, 1885. It is nice to be once more at this dear old post, particularly under such very pleasant circumstances. The winter East was enjoyable and refreshing from first to last, but citizens and army people have so little in common, and this one feels after being with them a while, no matter how near and dear the relationship may be. Why, 1/2 of them do not know the uniform, and could not distinguish an officer of the army from a policeman. I love army life here in the West, and I love all the things that it brings to me, the grand mountains, the plains, and the fine hunting. The buffalo are no longer seen. Every one has been killed off, and back of Square Butte in a rolling valley hundreds of skeletons are bleaching even now. The valley is about 2 miles from the post. We are with the commanding officer and his wife, and Hulda is here also. She was in Helena during the winter and came from there with us. I am so glad to have her. She is so competent, and will be such a comfort a little later on when there will be much entertaining for us to do. We stopped at Fort Ellis 2 days to see to the crating of the furniture and to get all things in readiness to be shipped here, this time by the cars instead of by wagon, through mud and water. We were guests of Captain and Mrs. Spencer, and enjoyed the visit so much. Dr. and Mrs. Lawton gave an informal dinner for us, and that was charming too, but the grand event of the stopover was the champagne supper that Captain Martin gave in our honor, that is, in honor of the new adjutant of the regiment. He is the very oldest bachelor and one of the oldest officers in the regiment, a very jolly Irishman. The supper was old-fashioned, with many good things to eat, and the champagne frappé was perfect. I do believe that the generous-hearted man had prepared at least 2 bottles for each one of us. Every member of the small garrison was there, and each officer proposed something pleasant in life for Faye, and often I was included. There was not the least harm done to anyone, however, and not a touch of headache the next day. As usual, we are waiting for quarters to avoid turning someone out, but for a few days this does not matter much, as our household goods are not here, except the rugs and things we sent out from Philadelphia. Faye entered upon his new duties at guard mounting this morning, and I scarcely breathed until the whole thing was over and the guard was on its way to the guardhouse. It was so silly, I knew, to be afraid that Faye might make a mistake, for he has mounted the guard hundreds of times while post adjutant. But here it was different. I knew that from almost every window that looked out on the parade ground, eyes friendly and eyes envious were peering to see how the new regimental adjutant conducted himself, and I knew that there was one pair of eyes, green from envy and pique, and that the least faux pas by Faye would be sneered at and made much of by their owner. But Faye made no mistake, of course. I knew all the time that it was quite impossible for him to do so, as he is one of the very best tacticians in the regiment. Still, it is the unexpected that so often happens. The band and the magnificent drum major, watching their new commander with critical eyes, were quite enough in themselves to disconcert any man. I never told you what happened to that band once upon a time. It was before we came to the regiment, and when headquarters were at Fort Dodge, Kansas. Colonel Mills, at that time a captain, was in command. It had been customary to send down to the river every winter a detail of men from each company to cut ice for their use during the coming year. Colonel Mills ordered the detail down as usual, and also ordered the band down. It seems that Colonel Fitzjames, who had been colonel of the regiment for some time, had babied the bandsmen one and all, until they had quite forgotten the fact of their being enlisted men. So over to Colonel Mills went the first sergeant with a protest against cutting ice, saying that they were musicians and could not be expected to do such work, that it would chap their lips and ruin their delicate touch on the instruments. Colonel Mills listened patiently, and then said, "But you like ice during the summer, don't you?" The sergeant said, "Yes, sir," but they could not do such hard work as the cutting of ice. Colonel Mills said, "You are musicians, you say?" The unsuspicious sergeant, thinking he had gained his point, smilingly said, "Yes, sir," but there must have been an awful weakness in his knees when Colonel Mills said, "Very well, since you are musicians and cannot cut ice, You will go to the river and play for the other men while they cut it for you." The weather was freezing cold, and the playing of brass instruments in the open air over 2 feet of solid ice would have been painful and difficult, so it was soon decided that it would be better to cut ice after all, and in a body the band went down with the other men to the river without further complaint or protest. It is a splendid band, and has always been regarded as one of the very best in the army, but there are a few things that need changing which Faye will attend to as quickly as possible, and at the same time bring criticism down upon his own head. The old adjutant is still in the post, and "eyes green" are here. End of letter. Fort Shaw, Montana Territory, August, 1885. My ride this morning was grand. My new horse is beginning to see that I am really a friend, and is much less nervous. It is still necessary, however, for Miller, our striker, to make blinders with his hands back of Rollo's eyes, so he will not see me jump to the saddle. Otherwise I might not get there. I mount in the yard back of the house, where no one can see me. The gate is opened first, and that the horse always stands facing. For the instant he feels my weight upon his back, there is a little flinch, then a dash down the yard, a jump over the acequia, then out through the gate to the plain beyond, where he quiets down and I fix my stirrup. There is not a bit of viciousness about this, as the horse is gentle and most affectionate at all times, but he has been terribly frightened by a saddle, and it is distressing to see him tremble and his very flesh quiver when one is put upon his back, no matter how gently. He had been ridden only 3 or 4 times when we bought him, and probably by a bronco breaker, who slung on his back a heavy Mexican saddle, cinched it tight without mercy, then mounted with a slam over of a leather-trousered leg, let the almost crazy horse go like the wind, and if he slackened his speed, spurs or quirt, perhaps both, drove him on again. I know only too well how the so-called breaking is done, for I have seen it many times, and the whole performance is cruel and disgraceful. There are wicked horses, of course, but there are more wicked men, and many a fine-spirited animal is ruined, made an outlaw that no man can ride, just by the fiendish way in which they are first ridden. But the more crazy the poor beast is made, the more fun and glory for the breaker. Rollo is a light sorrel and a natural pacer. He cannot trot 1 step, and for that reason I did not want him, but Faye said that I had better try him, so he was sent up. The fact of his being an unbroken colt, Faye seemed to consider a matter of no consequence, but I soon found that it was of much consequence to me, inasmuch as I was obliged to acquire a more precise balance in the saddle because of his coltish ways, and at the same time make myself, also the horse, perfectly acquainted with the delicate give and take of bit and bridle, for with a pacer the slightest tightening or slackening at the wrong time will make him break. When Rollo goes his very fastest, which is about 2:50, I never use a stirrup and never think of a thing but his mouth. There is so little motion to his body I could almost fancy that he had no legs at all, that we are being rushed through the air by some unseen force. It is fine. Faye has reorganized the band, and the instrumentation is entirely new. It was sent to him by Souza, director of the Marine Band, who has been most kind and interested. The new instruments are here, so are the 2 new sets of uniform, one for full dress, the other for concerts and general wear. Both have white trimmings to correspond with the regiment, which are so much nicer than the old red facings that made the band look as if it had been borrowed from the artillery. All this has been the source of much comment along the officers' quarters and in the barracks across the parade ground, and has caused several skirmishes between Faye and the band. It was about talked out, however, when I came in for my share of criticism. The post commander and Faye came over from the office one morning and said it was their wish that I should take entire charge of the music for services in church, that I could have an orchestra of soft-toned instruments and enlisted men to sing, but that all was to be under my guidance. I must select the music, be present at all practicings, and give my advice in any way needed. At first I thought it simply a very unpleasant joke, but when it finally dawned upon me that those two men were really in earnest, I was positive they must be crazy, and that I told them. The whole proposition seemed so preposterous, so ridiculous, so everything. I shall always believe that Bishop Brewer suggested church music by the soldiers. Faye is adjutant and in command of the band, so I was really the proper person to take charge of the church musicians if anybody did, but the undertaking was simply appalling. But the commanding officer insisted, and Faye insisted, and both gave many reasons for doing so. The enemy was too strong, and I was forced to give in, the principal reason being, however, that I did not want someone else to take charge. In a short time the little choir was organized, and some of the very best musicians in the band were selected for the orchestra. We have 2 violins, first and second, 1 clarinet, violoncello, oboe, and bassoon, the latter instrument giving the deep organ tones. There have been 3 services, and at one Sergeant Graves played an exquisite solo on the violin. There is a green hill far away, from the oratorio of St. Paul. At another, Matijicek played Gounod's Ave Maria on the oboe, and last Sunday he gave us, on the clarinet, Every Valley Shall Be Exalted. The choir proper consists of 3 sergeants and 1 corporal, and our tenor is His Magnificence the drum major. Service is held in a long, large hall, at the rear end of which is a smaller room that can be made a part of the hall by folding back large doors. We were just inside this small room, and the doors were open wide. On a long bench sat the 4 singers, 2 each side of a very unhappy woman, and back of the bench in a half circle were the 6 musicians. Those musicians depended entirely upon me to indicate to them when to play, and the vocalists when to sing. Therefore certain signals had been arranged so that there would be no mistake or confusion. There I sat on a hot summer morning, almost surrounded by expert musicians who were conscious of my every movement, and then those men were soldiers accustomed to military precision, and the fear of making a mistake and leading them wrong was agonizing. At the further end of the hall the Reverend Mr. Clark was standing, reading along in an easy, self-assured way that was positively irritating, and again there was the congregation, each one on the alert, ready to criticize, probably condemn, the unheard-of innovation. Every man, woman, and child was at church that morning, too, many from curiosity, I expect, and every time we sang, 1/2 of them turned around and stared at us. During the reading of the service I could not change my position, turn my head, or brush the flies that got upon my face, without those 6 hands back of me pouncing down for their instruments. It was impossible to sing the chants, as the string instruments could not hold the tones, so anthems were used instead, mostly millards, and they were very beautiful. Not one mistake has ever been made by anyone, but Sergeant Moore has vexed me much. He is our soprano, and has a clear, high tenor voice, and often sings solos in public, but for some unexplained reason he would not sing a note in church unless I sang with him, so I had to hum along for the man's ear alone. Why he has been so frightened I do not know, unless it was the unusual condition of things, which have been quite enough to scare anyone. Well, I lived through the 3 services, and suppose I can live through more. The men are not compelled to do this church work, although not one would think of refusing. There is much rehearsing to be done, and Sergeant Graves has to transpose the hymns and write out the notes for each instrument, and this requires much work. To show my appreciation of their obedience to my slightest request, a large cake and dozens of eggs have been sent to them after each service. It is funny how nice things to eat often make it easy for a man to do things that otherwise would be impossible. End of section 18.